Right now, in the eastern part of Ukraine, Russia is focusing on, quote-unquote, liberating the Donbass region as part of what it has always insisted is a special military operation, not an illegal invasion. And for the Ukrainians, what's happening on the ground is growing dire.
In general, the situation in Donbass remains extremely difficult. The Russian army is trying to gather superior force to put more and more pressure on our defenders. There, in Donbass, the maximum combat power of the Russian army is now gathered.
In the city of Donetsk, just ahead of the Russian army's assault, police have been going door to door to warn any citizens who haven't already left.
Katerina tells us the social worker who helped her has fled. She's 74 and frightened. Who wouldn't be? The policeman reassures her she'll get food and medicine. She's been living alone with her 84-year-old husband, who appears to have dementia, and they have little to eat and no power.
Heartbreaking. Ukraine's elderly among those who have suffered the most in the last 100 days. Yeah, Friday marks 100 days since this conflict started. 100 times that the earth has rotated on its axis since Vladimir Putin gave the order for Russian troops to invade Ukraine. 100 days of atrocities and crimes against humanity, like at least an estimated 4,000 Ukrainian civilians killed with another 4,000 injured, according to the UN, and that's likely a gross undercount. Nearly 7 million, let me say that again, 7 million refugees fleeing Ukraine, and that doesn't include an additional several million others inside Ukraine who have been displaced. There have also been dozens of schools destroyed, sometimes with children still in them. Hundreds of attacks on hospitals and other health facilities. What adds up so far to an estimated $600 billion in economic damage and losses to Ukraine. Again, I'm sure a conservative estimate. Putin thought Ukraine was going to cave. He thought his special military operation would have been over in just a day or two. The plan had been for his troops to take a quick jaunt south to capture the capital city of Kyiv, where surely the comedic actor turned head of state, the man who once pretended to be president on TV, would have accepted the Americans' offer to flee the country. But Volodymyr Zelensky surprised almost everyone by staying to lead his country, and the Ukrainians put up an astonishing defense with Western support to protect Kyiv. The Ukrainian government has remained in power, and people even began talking about the possibility of a Ukrainian victory. But while the battle for Kyiv may have been for now won, the war rages on, because the reality is, as I've already mentioned, Russia, despite setbacks, is still advancing across the eastern part of the country, in the Donbass. And let's please not forget the brutal, sustained siege on the city of Mariupol, where local authorities say more than 20,000 people have been killed. There doesn't seem to be an end in sight for this particular war. And there's a reason for the phrase forever wars. We've seen what happens when you get involved in these never-ending conflicts with no real way of measuring success or failure. All you can measure is the suffering, the body count. So what happens after the 100-day mark has come and gone, as other Western countries slowly maybe lose interest in what's happening in Kyiv or in Donetsk or in Mariupol? What then? Will I be sitting here 9 months from now telling you about the first anniversary of Russia's war in Ukraine? Will we even pay attention to the second anniversary? It sounds cruel, but this is what history, very recent history, teaches us. We become numb to the fighting in places like Iraq or Afghanistan. The media and the American public pay attention to the fighting intensely at the beginning, and then as time goes by, less and less so. At some point, people just stop paying attention altogether. So what will it take for this conflict, for Russia's war in Ukraine, invasion of Ukraine, to end before that happens, before we all turn away and allow the suffering to continue endlessly? Well, here's what the leader of another country that borders Russia thinks. The Prime Minister of Latvia told Politico that, quote, the main goal of ours has to be that Russia loses, and the other side of the coin is that Ukraine wins the war. Anything short of that means we have a very bad security situation in Europe. Easy to say when you're one of the smallest states with the biggest backup in the military alliance, schoolyard, NATO. Meanwhile, the nuclear-armed leader of the most powerful member of NATO says this in a new New York Times op-ed. President Biden, you remember him, writes, "We do not seek a war between NATO and Russia. As much as I disagree with Mr. Putin and find his actions an outrage, the United States will not try to bring about his ouster in Moscow. So long as the United States or our allies are not attacked, we will not be directly engaged in this conflict. We are not encouraging or enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders. We do not want to prolong the war just to inflict pain on Russia." It's a viewpoint that's shared by the head of state who matters most, the president of Ukraine himself.
And those discussions would be necessary in order to stop the war, in order to start resolving those difficulties and challenges through diplomatic channels. Otherwise, it's not going to be working. If it's all about ultimatums, you have to cede a third of your territory and then we'll leave you come and leave you alive. This is not something we can agree on.
For what it's worth, when President Zelensky and President Biden say diplomacy is the way forward, it has to be ended through negotiations, I agree with them. Diplomacy is the only way Russia's war in Ukraine is going to end. And I don't agree with Baltic leaders or hawkish DC think tankers or Republican politicians or even Joe Biden's own defense secretary who say Russia must be weakened, must be defeated, must be destroyed in order for this conflict to end. No, that's just not realistic, whatever one thinks about Russia and its awful leader. Not every war has to be turned into a proxy war. The goal should be to end the fighting in Ukraine, to achieve peace on the best possible terms for the Ukrainian people and as soon as possible, to end their suffering and to save their lives. So what will it take to get there before the years, if not the decades in Ukraine, start adding up? On the one hand, how many Ukrainians have to die before we in the West and the Baltic nations and the rest of NATO all get on board with a compromise, a peace deal, a diplomatic end to this war? On the other hand, can someone like Vladimir Putin ever be truly appeased? And isn't the ball in Russia's court? Does anyone really believe Putin is going to give up Crimea or the other parts of the Donbass that Russia has conquered? 100 days in, how on earth do we end this war and end the suffering? To help answer these questions, to debate the right way forward, let's bring in Peter Beinart, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents and author of Beinart Notebook on Substack, and an MSNBC contributor. Also, Julia Ioffe, co-founder and DC correspondent for Puck News, who's written about just this week about how DC's financial support for Ukraine could soon be ebbing. Thank you both for being here. Julia, let me start with you. When you hear people say, and when I say people, I don't mean Henry Kissinger, who came out recently and said, we need to give away land to sort of deal. Not Henry Kissinger. But when you hear other people say, look, there needs to be a compromise, there needs to be a deal done soon. Ukraine is never getting back all that territory. Let's be realistic about this. What is your instinctive response?
My instinctive response is to ask the Ukrainians. I think that kind of thinking is what got us into this situation to begin with. There tends to be a way of thinking both on the far right and the far left in the US and in Europe where that aligns and you know, this great power theory of geopolitics where what small nations want is overlooked and agency is taken away from them and their citizens. I don't think that if Volodymyr Zelensky were to cut a deal with the Russians tomorrow, for example, I don't know that most Ukrainians would accept it. And Ukraine is a democracy. He is accountable to his people. I think 100 days to us seems like a long time, and I'm sure to Ukrainians seems like an even longer time given how much they've suffered. But I think it is far too early to be talking about compromise, concessions. You know, it's interesting. Last week, I interviewed the Russian diplomat who resigned in protest over the war. And it was the same day that Henry Kissinger, who is a sometime advisor to Vladimir Putin, it should be noted. And I asked him, you know, what do you think about what Henry Kissinger just said a few hours ago? And this Russian diplomat, who until, 24 hours before we spoke had been working in the Russian foreign ministry, said, absolutely not. You cannot make peace with him right now because Russia will see this as a victory. It will just take a couple of years to regroup and then we'll do something else. We'll attack again, just as it did after 2014. Yeah. So it was interesting to hear somebody who until recently had been serving the Russian state say, absolutely not, do not compromise with my government. So,
Peter, let's pick up on that point that Julia makes, quoting that former Russian diplomat. Vladimir Putin got Crimea in 2014. In a sense, he already got a bit of land, a big chunk of land from a next door country, which basically the West said, fine, keep it. It's not like the West went to war to save Crimea. The Ukrainian government de facto let him have Crimea. It didn't stop him from coming back again in 2022, did it?
No, I mean, I think we could all agree about what would be the best outcome. The best outcome would be a Russian military collapse that allows Ukraine to reconquer all of the territory that they have the right to have, and perhaps even to see, you know, the replacement of Vladimir Putin with a more benign, if not democratic, Russian leader. I guess the question I have is, it doesn't seem to. I haven't seen anyone who suggested a remotely realistic path by which that's likely to happen. And even Zelensky himself seems to kind of acknowledge in various statements that that's very, very unlikely. I agree with Julia that the U.S. cannot morally or even practically force a diplomatic solution if Ukraine's elected president is against it. But I also would hope that the United States would not, in its effort to weaken and bleed Russia, stand in the way or try to forestall a diplomatic agreement that, in fact, Zelensky was willing to make.
Julia, Peter mentions he mentioned the word bleeding Russia. I want to play a clip to you that we've played before on this show. Massachusetts Congressman Seth Moulton, Democrat, on Fox a month ago. Have a listen.
But at the end of the day, we've got to realize we're at war. And we're not just at war to support the Ukrainians. We're fundamentally at war, although it's somewhat through a proxy, with Russia. And it's important that we win.
We're fundamentally at war with Russia and we have to win. That kind of rhetoric is at best unhelpful and at worst pretty dangerous, is it not?
Oh, I think it's kind of beside the point, frankly, because the Russian state and the Russian state media have been talking like this since before the war even started. They consider themselves to be at war with us and with NATO. So whatever one congressman out of 435 says on Fox News doesn't really matter, because Russians and the Russian state considers itself to be at war with us, not with Ukraine. The other thing I would mention is that it's very hard to compromise with a leader who stated position has been not to, as soon as the war started, it wasn't about land. It was about annihilating Ukraine as a country and the very idea of Ukrainianness. This is a government that is purging all new textbooks of the mere mention of Ukraine, the name, Ukraine, the sovereign country, right? This is a theme that's constantly talked about on Russian state media, right? So how are you going to compromise on that if one side is trying to completely annihilate the very idea of the other country's existence? It's very hard to compromise with a leader who sees things as a zero-sum game. And when the other side is a democratically elected leader who is responsible to his people, and his people do not seem to want to compromise with Vladimir Putin. So I think we have to accept the limitations also of our agency in this.
But
before I get Peter to respond, go on, actually jump in.
So President Zelensky has already suggested a willingness to compromise. I mean, he's already suggested that, for instance, NATO membership in Ukraine is not on the table. So, and when I hear, the talk about how enormously difficult compromise is, given the kind of person who Vladimir Putin is, and given the profound immorality of allowing Russia to hold any Ukrainian territory, I completely agree. But what I don't understand is what if compromise seems impossible, I don't see how victory seems possible. I just haven't seen anyone sketch out a strategy by which Ukraine is going to actually regain all that territory, even in the Donbass, let alone Crimea.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I don't think anybody disagrees with you, Peter. And I certainly don't disagree with you. I think the issue is, before the war, everybody in the West was tying themselves in knots over, is this about NATO or is this not about NATO? And what if Ukraine just took itself out of the game in terms of NATO membership? Well, as you said, Volodymyr Zelensky did that just like a month into the war. He said, fine, we'll be neutral. but Russia didn't stop the war because, again, it isn't about NATO and it isn't about territory. It's about annihilating the entire country and the idea that there is a separate country called Ukraine. So just as victory at this point is very difficult, I think compromising with that kind of annihilating, genocidal, frankly, vision is also very difficult. All of which is to say that maybe it is too soon to be talking about compromise. I think the battlefield, the situation on the battlefield doesn't merit it yet, frankly.
Peter, let me ask you this. Julia raises the issue of the NATO membership debate. And I know you and I are both people who have raised the issue of NATO expansion. Was that a factor in exacerbating this conflict, in provoking the Russians, et cetera, et cetera? And that is something that I've talked about on this show with other guests, with former Ambassador Michael McFaul, with Julia beforehand, with you. But what do you do with this idea? And Julia's mentioned it already. What do you do with the fact that Vladimir Putin went on TV and said he does not accept that Ukraine is an independent country? Doesn't that make all other arguments null and void? Or how do you respond to that?
I mean, I think that's certainly his desire and his ambition. But because of the valiance of Ukrainians, because of their extraordinary heroism, and to a lesser degree, because of the support they've gotten from the United States and Europe, Vladimir Putin has not succeeded in that goal. And just as it seems very, very hard to imagine that Ukraine could expel Russia from Ukrainian territory, which they have every right to do, but seem unable to do, it also seems at this point very, very unlikely that Vladimir Putin is going to succeed in his desire to erase Ukraine from the map or turn it into an utter puppet state by taking its capital. So in between those two realities, we have the situation we're in now. Julia may well be right that the conditions are not right for a diplomatic settlement now. But my fear is if you look at what's happening on the ground at this moment, things are not moving in the right direction. They're actually moving in the wrong direction. So my fear is that with every passing day and week, the terms of a diplomatic solution may actually be worse than they were. Now, they could turn around. I'm not military strategist, but right now they're not moving in the right direction on the ground.
So last question, I want to put it to you, Julia. Listening to you speak, you mentioned a moment ago, victory might not be happening soon, but now's not necessarily the time for compromise. What happens? And I feel like listening to you, we're heading into whatever you want to call it, stalemate, quagmire, forever war. I mean, President Zelensky on Newsmax was talking about losing 100 Ukrainian soldiers a day. I mean, that is a huge loss of Ukrainian people on a daily basis.
It is a massive loss. And I think, the count of Ukrainian civilians killed that you showed earlier is a vast undercount. Yeah. But, and I don't think it's a stalemate, and I don't think it's a quagmire just yet. Unfortunately, as Peter mentioned correctly, it is a dynamic situation where Russia's picking up more and more territory. I think it is, to some extent, up to the Ukrainians how many people they want to lose and how badly they want to fight. I think at this point, it seems like Ukrainians feel that it is worth losing 150 to 100 soldiers a day rather than losing their entire country and living under a Russian dictatorship. Again, I think when we talk about compromise, we have to think about what Ukraine and Ukrainians want. We cannot just sweep their agency and their democratic desires aside because we're tired after 100 days. If they're not tired, then we have no right to be.